We are David and Caroline Stafford.
I'm David, she's Caroline.
We've got this book on the police, The Adventures of Sting, Stuart and Andy, coming out on the 26th of August.
And it's so good, we named it 3 times. It's called The Police, that's the first title. The second title is Every Little Thing. And the third title is The Adventures of Sting, Stuart and Andy. So in effect, you're getting 3 books for the price of 1. Go for it. Why did we write it? It sort of developed out of conversation that we'd been having for quite a long time about why so many bands fail, why, you know, one or more of them die, or one or more of them end up in some sort of institution, or why they produce a couple of decent records and then completely fall apart, or why they end up with absolutely no money at all. And it would always appear that that's the story of most bands. Something goes horribly wrong. One of them drowns in a swimming pool or ends up in a mental institution or something.
Well, and with the police, it seems to have gone horribly right.
Yeah.
In a way.
We started trying to think of bands. Well, first of all, you have to define what right is. And second, you have to think of a band that did it. And the police ended up with all their money. They were commercially and to some extent critically viable, and to some extent still are, and they've sort of retained their reputation, and they only went a bit mad really, and most of them were slightly all 3 were slightly unhinged in the first place anyway, so it was a sort of healthy madness. Another point to bear in mind is that it's 35 years since they were sort of around, so there aren't any original police fans left who are under the age of 50. And when you get to be the age of 50, it starts being a time when you start looking back, partly usually to figure out where it all went so badly wrong, but partly to figure out who you are and where did you come from. And that's not nostalgia, it's sort of self-analysis, if you like, and it's a necessary part. And if a band like the Police were, a sort of vital part of your adolescence or 20s or whatever, they are built into you. They are part of your identity. And the dust
settled. It's really interesting that at the reunion tour, which was in 2007, 2008, Stuart said, looking out at the audiences, they were so different because he used to be hysterical girls sort of screaming at them and lusting after Sting's body. But when he looked then, there were just men weeping, grown men weeping, remembering their youth.
So, yeah, the dust has settled now and we can look back objectively. I think another point is that both of us, completely separately, very, very tangentially, just touched on the orbit of the Police in the late 70s, early 80s. Go on, you tell your story.
Well, yeah, I was just a sort of hanger on because the boyfriend I had at the time was a friend of Stuart's, and we used to go along to gigs, and occasionally we would graffiti the band's name on walls, and I remember one afternoon I spent phoning up Radio 1 to try and get Roxanne onto the playlist. That was a fun afternoon.
You failed.
Yeah, failed at the first attempt, yeah. But we're just sort of hanging around in basements with them when they were trying to make it.
That's her link. My link is I used to write for and play music for the comedian Alexei Sayle. And in the early 80s, Sting became something of an Alexei Sayle fan. And we were doing a gig at the Albany Empire, which I don't know if it's still there anymore. And Sting came along in a crash helmet. Some memories say he kept the crash helmet on so that nobody would recognise him, but I don't remember that bit. But afterwards, he took us out to Joe Allen's, the restaurant in Covent Garden. And by this time, I'd had quite a lot to drink. Alexei says that I'd been taking night nurse for a cold, which I think is just very kind of him. But I'd had quite a lot to drink. And then when we got there, it was very posh. They kept the restaurant open just for us, just for Sting. And there was a bottle of champagne in an ice bucket at every place setting. So I finished mine, and then somebody else didn't want theirs, so I finished theirs as well. And then I had I wasn't feeling very well, so I got up and looked for the toilets, and I couldn't find the toilet. So I went outside and threw up heartily and mightily, leaning against something. And then I looked up and saw Sting's chauffeur looking at me very, very critically. And I realised I'd just thrown up all over the bonnet of Sting's limo. That's my connection. It's not an honourable one. The thing about graffitiing the police on walls, which they did, was it was a very difficult time. The police were like the sus laws were around. If you don't know what the sus laws were, Google them. But the police were very, very unpopular at the time. So the notion the police is bastards, that would have been a reasonable thing to write on a wall. Or if you were of the other persuasion, the boys in blue are doing a wonderful job, you might have wanted to graffiti that. But just the police was confusing. Why would anybody just write the police? It's like just just writing Ireland or Vietnam.
You needed context.
Yes, you need a context. You need an opinion with it. Yes. One of the joys, I suppose, of writing a book like this is that you can't write about a band or the history of a band without writing the social history of the time. So you do get sort of bound up with that, and you start having to try and figure out what actually went on there. And those years from 1978 to 1975, in very much the terms of the Chinese proverb, were interesting times. May you be cursed to live in interesting times. And they were the early Thatcher years, which, depending on your political persuasion, were horrible. And the police sort of were part of that, and they also started with those punk years.
The punk years that never
worked really. Yeah.
Well, and punk wasn't as big as we thought it was. Even the Damned, which we used to follow religiously, they didn't have any hits. The Clash had some hits, and the Sex Pistols, but the Sex Pistols were sort of novelty act, really. So punk for the whole of the country wasn't a big deal.
The songs that were selling, the big hits were Boney M's Rivers of Babylon and Rah Rah Rasputin. Kiki D and Elton John, Don't Go Breaking My Heart, or was that a bit earlier? And stuff like, I can't remember what else was it. The Captain and Tennille probably was right at that time as well. But if you actually examine the charts for the punk is hardly making an impression on it, and it's mostly sort of almost like novelty hits, like Boney M and stuff like that. Oh, ABBA was huge, of course, at that time as well, which isn't quite a novelty hit. But I'm sorry if I've just upset a lot of ABBA fans. But go on. You were saying about punk.
And punk was how they positioned themselves. And it was very much influenced by Stuart. Stuart had decided that he wanted a punk band. And Sting was jazz rock.
Yeah, they were all desperately... The problem was that they were all desperately overqualified and slightly too old to even think about being a punk band. There's that thing, here's a chord, here's another chord, now form a band. They knew hundreds and hundreds of chords already. They were completely musically literate people. Andy had studied classical guitar in California and had been playing with everybody for years, every kind of music imaginable. Sting had been in the most credible Newcastle band called Last Exit, which was basically a jazz rock outfit, and had also played with the Newcastle Big Band, was literate in several different genres of music. And Stuart had been to university and studied music in California, and had also played drums with Curved Air, which was, not a three-chord band by any stretch of the imagination. So they were all far too musically literate and far too old to ever think of being a proper punk band. They were fakes, and everybody knew that they were fakes at the gigs.
I mean, I remember seeing them at Dingle's in Camden, and they had a very, very limited set. and they played everything through really, really quickly, and then they did the set again straight away. So they just repeated it so they could fill up like 30 minutes of time. And they just went all the way through. They didn't stop, because you didn't stop if you were a punk band, because you know, if people applauded you, that was an insult. That was terrible. So they just went all the way through. So, you know, 35 minutes, we're off.
And it was, I mean, it was a year or two, really, that they eventually decided we're not a punk band, are we? And developed their new sound, which had a lot to do with Andy, because in the early days, Andy wasn't with the band. It was Henry Padovani was their guitar player. And he and, well, all of them really decided that they should let their musical literacy show just a little bit. And they invented, well, in fact, Andy talks about it, and he calls it policification. There was a certain sound that they could make, you know, Andy with a certain guitar sound and a sort of minimal playing, and Stuart with a, you know, those skittery hi-hat things that he did and stuff like that, and Sting at the bottom. Sting's vocals sailing, soaring over the top of it. And he called it policification. And they discovered that they could policify any song. So you could, you know, you could take Rivers of Babylon and do it in the style of the Police. And they had discovered this style that was well, actually by that time there wasn't very much punk in it. There was a lot of reggae into it. They'd become reggae fans by then. So the reggae lilt was all the way through it. And it's quite possible that also reggae informed Sting's voice. If you listen to Sting before they sort of got into the reggae, he didn't have quite the same voice as he did afterwards. And I think there was an extent to which he was channeling Bob Marley, and it gave him a sort of persona that he never lost.
That he used very much in Outlanders to More.
Yeah. On the first album.
Yeah, with Roxanne and So Lonely. Lonely. So great. Yeah. Marley track.
Yeah, and people accused him of doing a Jamaican accent. Which,
the Clash really used to make fun
lay into him. But you know, he said, no, it's not. It's a Newcastle accent. But, you know, people do tell terrible fibs, don't
they? In May 2019, so barely 2 years ago, Every Breath You Take was recognised as being the most performed song in their catalogue, overtaking You've Lost That Loving Feeling by the Righteous Brothers. And it's such an interesting song, and it means so much to so many people. I mean, Sting talks about people using it at their weddings, but in fact he wrote it when he was splitting up from his wife Frances, who'd helped him so much in his early career. And strangely, Frances has never married again. And you can just think of the reason she didn't was because any potential suitor would have the sound of Sting in his ears going, every breath you take, every move you make. It's really quite chilling.
I'll be watching you. It is one of the most actually sort of ominous songs that's ever been written. What's the Elvis Costello one? I Want You.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that one. That's a very similar song actually, isn't it? I Want You. Anyway, The Police, Every Little Thing, The Adventures of Sting, Stuart and Andy by Caroline and David Stafford, out in hardback on August the 26th. Buy 4 copies because you'll wear one out reading him. In the very early days, in 1977, before Andy had joined the band, they were booked to do support for an American punk act called Cherry Vanilla, well, a punk singer called Cherry Vanilla. And they also, Sting and Stuart, became her backing band for so they were on tour with this woman around England for quite a long time. At the time, Sting was married to Frances Tumulty, and Stuart's partner was Sonia Christina, who used to be the singer with Curved Hair, and they're both mentioned, which is why. On the road, the Police did not, at this stage anyway, fully embrace the rock and roll lifestyle. According to Cherry Vanilla, their high of choice was Benylin cough mixture from Boots. The recipe did give a halfway decent high before the spoilsports removed some vital ingredients in the 1980s. Or maybe they didn't remove the vital ingredient, but users' tolerance rose. They couldn't afford hotel rooms, so often had to ask people in the venues if anybody could give them a bed for the night. There was Sting with his cheekbones. Henry Padovani was the guitar player at this time. Henry with his ugly, beautiful French film star looks, and Stuart, the hairy-assed silverback motherfucker banging tree trunks. And they were asking if anybody could give them a bed for the night. I imagine, said Cherry, it must have been hard for those guys to avoid certain compromising situations. She got to know and like Francis and Sonia, so did her best to discourage any of that groupie nonsense or sordid dalliance. Sting was perhaps the least rock and roll of the three. Whenever we went on the road, Cherry said, Francis packed him a week's worth of sandwiches and fruit in a box so he wouldn't have to spend money on fish and chips like the rest of us. After they played Middlesbrough on the 12th of March, the whole band stayed at Sting's parents' house. Thank you very much for having us, Mrs. Sumner, conjecture might have Stuart saying. You're welcome, lads, you can imagine Audrey replying. Always nice to meet Gordon's friends. Now, there's a flask of tea in there for you. 2 sugars, just the way you like it. Rock and roll. We're talking about Synchronicity, which was their last album. The last proper studio album. The songs were some of the best loved of the previous 10 years. The album went straight in at number 1, stayed in the top 10 until mid-January, and didn't leave the top 100 until July 1987. The world had changed. The technology, the style, the music, everything. A new breed of human had emerged, the product of all that aspiration that Thatcher had encouraged. People who'd benefited from her hard work pays and success is rewarded promise. They were called yuppies, young, upwardly mobile professionals. You saw them everywhere, mostly in wine bars, where they ate fancy quiche and banoffee pie and drank Beaujolais Nouveau. Their role model was the man in the Renault 25 ad played by the young Anthony Head, who, in the smuggest voice with the smuggest face ever known to humankind, turned to his worryingly posh wife as he played with the electric windows and adjusted the climate control and said, I'm starting my own business. John's with me, Ian's with me, and we've got the backing. The men wore suits or Fiorucci jeans at weekends. Their neckties alone cost more than a punk would spend on clothes in 17 lifetimes. The women had hair like Princess Diana and wore Betty Jackson blouses with pie crust collars. Yuppies did not buy records. They did not buy cassettes. They invested in the tiny, shiny perfection of the CD, then had to have their houses rebuilt to accommodate hi-fi systems accurate enough to capture those shimmering highs and mud-free lows. The CD played clean. No hiss, no clicks, no pops, no grunge. And they had the advantage of being a lot more expensive than records. Line them up on the shelf and it's like displaying actual currency for your friends to admire. The latest must-have was the in-car CD player. Get one of those in your BMW. The Renault 25 was nice in the advert, but let's be serious about this. And you could glide along the M40 to see Boo and Ginny in Tame with hiss-free, click-free, pop-free music playing all the way. And what was the perfect clean music to play all the way from Islington to Tame? You want to slam the greatest hits in, swing round the Hanger Lane gyratory, then onto the A40, put your foot down, hear the S38 unit deliver the revs, and as it does so, you want the blowpunkt to go, thwack, every little thing she does is magic. The Police, Dire Straits, Fleetwood Mac had all become CD music, yuppie music, BMW music. It wasn't their fault. Sting and Mark and Lindsay never meant it to happen. There was just something about Andy's shimmering guitar, Stuart's snappy snare, and Sting's vocal register that suited analog to digital to analog reproduction in a luxury vehicle.